be probably one of the most challenging aspects of it. We could bring them in here if you want to wrestle them down while we study.
Yeah, I'm pretty heavy. I can just sit on them.
Yeah, there you go. Alrighty, so we're in chapter 6. No, we're not. Not in chapter 6, excuse me. We're in chapter 8 of Brother Lewis's book, The Domino Effect. And we're looking here at the Golden Rule. And we're studying ways in which we can approach various aspects of life, specifically dealing with the Golden Rule and approaching it from the Golden Rule. What's the Golden Rule? Matthew 7 and verse 12. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Therefore, whatsoever you want men to do to you, do also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. We talked last week about the way in which we think about this and how clearly there is a command being given both here as well as Mark chapter 12. We see in verse 30 and following Jesus mentioning that the first law, they're asking, what is the first commandment of all? And Jesus responds, verse 30, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. This is the first commandment. And the second is like, namely this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So there's a need to love ourselves, but we don't love ourselves for ourselves, other than the fact that we want to go to heaven and be with God. Ultimately, by loving ourselves and wanting to go to heaven, we become selfless, and we become very focused on others. But in loving others like then we've loved ourselves as Christians, we then want others to also have that same mission in life and that same purpose, which is to love God and keep His commandments. And we went to 1 John chapter 5 and looked there in verse 2 specifically, that God explains to us that loving, let's just go there again. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 2. A lot of times folks will say, well, you don't love me because you're telling me what God's will is. You don't love me because you're doing what God says. Well, no, that is loving you. 1 John 5 and verse 2, by this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and keep His commandments. See, folks sometimes say, well, I want you to love me. And what they're saying is, let me do whatever it is I want to do. Don't ever tell me I'm doing anything wrong. Don't ever in any way live in such a manner that makes me feel guilty, and love me. Well, that's not loving you. To love you is to love God and keep His commandments, to do what God says, and that's how you can truly be loved. And that is needful for us to reflect upon and think about. And we discussed in this chapter the golden rule in spreading the gospel on page 77, and talked a little bit about the song mentioned there, You Never Mentioned Him to Me, and just thinking about the state that we would be in if we were not Christians. We understand what it means to have the joy of being in Christ, because we've made the decision to obey the gospel. Now, other people, unfortunately, have not made that decision, but if we were in their state, we would want someone to tell us, and knowing what we know now. We know that they might be clouded and distracted and unwilling to hear the truth in that moment, but when we put ourselves in their shoes, how do we feel for them? Do we envy them? Sometimes we may be tempted to. The psalmist writes about, the rich folks seem to be well off when they're not obeying God. So maybe there's a temptation to envy them. But really, deep down, when we think about their state, how do we feel for them? Sad, bad, right? You feel just like you want to explain to them. You just want to sit down and say, do you realize what you're doing? You don't know what you're missing in this life, and ultimately you don't know the decision that you're making for eternity. And when we think about it from the golden rule perspective, it can, and this is what we kind of spent a lot of our time talking about last week, it can provoke us to approach folks in the right kind of way, with the right kind of attitude, as we seek to teach them the truth. So now let's go through some of these other areas. We already went over the golden rule in business, page 73. The golden rule in our personal boundaries, page 74. I think we maybe touched a little bit on the golden rule in our speech, but I don't think we dug too deep into it. If someone wants to read that first paragraph there, he deals with several issues concerning our speech and the tongue on top of page 76.
The golden rule should not only guide our business relationships and moral standards, it should also govern what we say about other people. The inspired book of James addresses this subject frequently and forcefully. In the very first chapter of the letter, James tells readers, if anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but he deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. In chapter 3, in what might be the Bible's most powerful and comprehensive teaching on taming the tongue, James described the tongue as a small, powerful, destructive, unruly, and incredibly inconsistent. In chapter 4, he uses the straightforward command, do not speak evil of one another, brethren.
Okay, do these things happen? I mean, yes, he's dealing with it then, but it happens today too as well. Our tongues can get us into a lot of trouble. They are one of those things about our existence that just is never going to be tamed, as James describes as he's being inspired by God. The golden rule in our speech ought to provoke us in several ways. First of all, do you care about how you are spoken to? Not what is said. Take that out for a second. Do you care how you're spoken to? I know you wives, especially here, have a real easy answer. Do you care how you are addressed? Yes. What matters when it comes to how you are being addressed? What are the elements that play a part? Or I'm saying you husbands, but maybe you feel the same way sometimes. It tends to be with men. We just maybe don't realize it as much. What matters?
The attitude of the one speaking.
Okay, so the attitude, just the general, just demeanor?
Demeanor.
Sure. What about the volume of the voice?
And
Right?
the tone.
The tone? Absolutely, the tone of the voice. There's several pieces. There's, you kind of talk about attitude. That's kind of almost everything, really, if you think about it. It's the demeanor, it's the body language, it would be the tone, it would be the volume of speech. All of those things matter. And so when we think about the golden rule, treating others, thinking about others, approaching others the way we would want to be treated, even if we've done something in error in our need of correction, even if we have, been living a life that is unfaithful to the Lord, if we were in that position, how would we want to be addressed? And I think the answers to that can be abundant as we seek to strive to reach out to souls. And it's never going to, fully exhaust itself. In other words, we could say, well, I'd maybe want a letter, but then if that didn't work, maybe I'd want this, or maybe I'd want... And that can provoke us and spur thought and ideas as to how we can really reach out to folks who we care about. He, of course, deals with James chapter 3. We've discussed before, and we will continuously, Proverbs 18 and verse 21, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit thereof. Our tongue can be dangerous, but folks, our tongue can also be very, very beneficial. It can do a great deal of good. Can you think of some times where the tongue, in certain situations and states in your life, has been of a great benefit to you? Not your tongue, but somebody else's.
When they tell you thank you, or are sympathetic with you about something that's happened.
Sure. You said even thank you, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Kind words.
right. Something sometimes as easy and simple as a thank you. That can be beneficial for us. Kind words, being compassionate. We have neighbors that have, we need to add them to the prayer list, but their newborn son has some kind of a disease, and they're not really sure what it is yet. And when the doctors first explained this disease, they'd been at the hospital, I think for like about a week, just living there with the newborn and not eating, all these tests. And the doctors came in and they basically just said, he has blank, and then they asked him questions and they basically shrugged him off and left. And, the neighbor is telling this to Hannah and just in tears and just, you can imagine the difficulty just with everything going on in that type of circumstance. But obviously the doctor was thinking about his, other plans or activities for the day or other maybe patients or whatever, and just was not in any way maybe being considerate of how he was going to communicate this news that was going to be life-changing, and it had an impact. And the same can be true if it's done the right way. I've heard of folks say before in being trained to preach, sometimes the best thing to do is to just listen and to just say, yes, I understand, or I can imagine how that feels, or, I don't have the answers either. Just few words sometimes. Sometimes when folks are conflicted and they're grieving, we think we need to just, pick them back up and, try to make them feel better. Well, that's not how grieving works. Sometimes with grieving, which we need to do is respond with maybe the fewest words possible, and just seek to say and express our compassion and pity for them in that moment. And just say, I just really can't imagine how it is you must feel. And that alone can be a benefit to someone. So it's both death and life. It's both. We don't need to just look at the tongue as a negative, because it can be used for a positive as well. He deals with here regarding gossip, and that's definitely something that will never go away. There is the temptation to be gossipy, if you will. Proverbs 18 and verse 8, the Proverbs writer writes, "The words of a talebearer are as wounds, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly." What is it that's so hard or tempting, I would say? What's the appeal of gossip? I think there's several. What are some of the main highlights? Why would someone ever want to gossip?
Self-aggrandizement.
Really, that's what it boils down to, right? It's not really the other person or even the details about that. Who cares about that? And it's not even really the person that they're talking to. Ultimately, it is, I have a piece of information, and I want to share it. And in doing so, I hope that I will be elevated to a state of power or a state of admiration because of the news that I have. That seems to be the motivation a lot of the times. Go ahead.
I've heard Christian people say before, well, if I think it, I might as well say it. But that is totally wrong. I mean,
They need to read James chapter 3.
I mean, if you're thinking something in your heart, it might be saying to you, but if you speak it out, you may cause somebody else sin also.
Sure.
And that's a bad sin to call somebody else sin.
So you're talking about gossip. And
Anything.
yeah,
I mean,
okay.
I've
Sure.
heard people say before, I can't remember who it was, but one lady said left church one night. She said, "I gotta go because I gotta go home and get my kids in bed." And one of the other ladies spoke up, and said, "What is she going? What was it, Karen? No, there's what's the girl on the pumpkin, the cartoon,
Oh, Lucy.
no, the pump turns into a pumpkin.
Cinderella.
Is she gonna turn into a
Cinderella.
pumpkin at midnight?
Cinderella.
That's what
Oh, okay, yeah.
And she said that. Well, that ended up hurt that lady.
Right.
I mean, sometimes it's best to keep your mouth shut.
Sure. Right. Sensitivity, right? And some people do a lot better job of being sensitive, and some people do a really good job at being insensitive, right? And it is difficult. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that maybe even in the church, a lot of times we don't consider, because of who we're talking to about someone else, that it's gossip, right? And I can tell you from personal experience, somebody I'm pretty close to that for years and years enjoyed talking about folks,
Right.
and said that she ought to be able to do it because of who she was talking to.
Right.
And I don't think that's scriptural.
Sure.
Now, with one exception, if I'm talking to my wife about something, we're one, right?
Right.
That to me is a little bit different,
Mhm.
unless someone has said, please don't mention this to anyone, so
Right.
depending on what it is, I guess, but, I mean, if I'm coming to you talking about Brother George, because of something that has happened, If I hadn't been to him,
Right.
there's some issues. So I think, I think a lot of times we think, well, I'm just talking to so-and-so, so it's okay.
Right.
It's not.
Right.
It's gossip.
Right. Well, and to that point, I didn't even think about gossip in that category. I was thinking of it more of like passing something along, which you're still doing. But we said first, gossip, maybe the temptation or interest is power and for one's own self. But maybe it's also to find some relief for a difficulty that you've had with someone else. But to your point, and I think this
It
also
should
is
be had with that person.
exactly, and it's deceitful to our own selves. It's deceptive to begin disobeying the Lord and talking with someone else about an altercation or an offense that another has brought upon us. Because what does it do? It gives us the impression that it's off our shoulders, right? But it's not dealt with. The next time we see that person, is that offense still there? Yes. So and then what we think we're doing is solving, quote, the offense by just trying to pass it along to other people who are not the people that actually offended us, thinking that we're finding relief. But we're not. And we end up turning into a gossip because we're literally just sharing with others the offenses that have been brought upon us. Matthew chapter 18 and verse 15, those offenses are to be brought forth to the individual that offended. Verse 15, moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. But if he will not hear thee, then take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as an heathen man and a publican. There is a process that we are to go through. And the question is, and we've talked about this before and studied it, if we're not offended enough to the point to go to that individual and tell them and deal with it, then we're not really offended. And we need to just figure out another way, maybe through prayer or maybe just dropping it and moving on. If we really are offended, here's how we deal with it. We don't just pick up the phone or the text message and start talking about it. Any other comments on gossip? No? Okay. All right. The golden rule in our giving. The golden rule in our giving. We just studied a few moments ago, James chapter 1 and verse 27. James chapter 1 and verse 27, where James writes there that pure religion undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widow in their affliction and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. There is the temptation to perceive others through our own world. In other words, I do this, I do that, therefore I have my provisions, I have my necessities, I have my life in order maybe. And I think Hank maybe mentioned a comment a few weeks ago along these lines. In other words, I've figured it out, why haven't they? And because they haven't figured it out, I don't need to pay them any attention. It's their own fault. That's dangerous because the Lord did not treat us that way, and we're not being mindful ultimately of the afflictions and difficulties that others may be having, the plights that are in their life. And, you know, maybe some in here are related or are themselves or are connected to orphans, fatherless, widows. We all, of course, are connected to widows, but, you know, that lifestyle and the challenges that face those types of circumstances are some of the most difficult that one could face. And, you know, it's tempting to allow the demands of life and the, you know, never-ending realities of orphans and widows to make us numb to how difficult such circumstances are. And that's not carrying out the golden rule. In Durham, there was an elder one of the elders, just really, this was his verse. And I remember he would come into the office and we'd be talking about, things we could collaborate on and folks we could visit and things we could mention in prayer together. And a lot of times he would bring up, let's try to schedule some time to go visit, the widows in the car. He wanted to just constantly be making sure that we were visiting and that we were, spending time with them together, going in and making sure. And a lot of times, especially nowadays, these ladies were cared for. There was one situation where the lady was very cared for and well off because of the provisions of her children, but her children were not Christians. She was faithful, but her children weren't. As a matter of fact, her son was a homosexual, and she was pained by it. She, did not have any other brethren within her family other than her husband who had passed. We would sit down and just talk with her. And that's one of the things, too. It's interesting that the word visit is used, but sometimes we think being hospitable and hospitality, we think about it in the sense that, well, I need to bring someone a dinner. No, sometimes we just need to sit down and talk with folks. We need to just listen to them, especially widows. Because if you're not careful, they can be overlooked, and that's dangerous. Any comments on that specifically before we move on?
Sean, I go over at that nursing home, and there's some ladies over there that never get visited. They say they don't have any family, or what family they do have never comes to see them, and
Right.
It is so sad.
Right.
I can go in there and I start talking to mother. If it's room, 3 or 4 or 5 of them will gather around.
Right.
And just start talking.
Right.
Because they just hunger for
Interaction.
interaction.
Right. Right. And our world and the way that we deal with our elderly, it's not wrong in and of itself, but there are some families who absolutely, the mindset is, at a certain age, it's in a home and bills will be paid, and then they don't get visited, they don't get talked to, and that's unfortunate. But it is, to your point, George, it's an opportunity maybe for us to reach out.
Well, and, I'm a widow, but if you don't have family or a job or something, it could be very lonely.
Right.
And I have a friend back home that her husband just died recently, and I call her every day because she needs that little bit of support.
Sure.
And I call her every morning before I go to work, and then if she's not working that night, she works a few hours at Walmart as a door greeter.
Sure.
And, she's told me several times, she said, I couldn't make it if you didn't call me.
Oh, sure. Speaking of which, just side notes, when we were just talking about Durham, is Miss Wanda still? Do you still talk?
I haven't heard from her
Okay.
for a while. I hear another friend.
Okay.
I hear about her, but I haven't.
Okay.
I haven't talked to her.
Well, Miss Wanda was one of the widows at Durham that we'd go visit.
And her
she
and I-
had children around and grandchildren around who, I think one was faithful, I think.
Well, her son, she doesn't even know where he is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but her daughter is.
It is, right, okay.
But we went to church at, when her husband was alive, he was one of our elders
Sure.
at New Bern, North Carolina.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that's, again, you just imagine, especially these ladies who don't have a family that's taken. The congregation has so many opportunities. And let's go to Timothy and just look for a moment. 1 Timothy chapter 5. Let's read there and begin in verse 3. Honor widows that are widows indeed, but if any widow have children or nephews, let them learn first to show piety at home and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. Now she that is a widow indeed and desolate, in other words, family is not able to care for her, trusteth in God and continueth in supplications and prayers night and day. But she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth. And these things give in charge, that they may be blameless. But if any provide not for his own, especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith, and is worse than an infidel. Let not a widow be taken into the number under 80 years old, having been the wife of one man, well reported of for good works, if she have brought up children, if she have lodged strangers, if she have washed the saints' feet, if she have relieved the afflicted, if she have diligently followed every good work. There is an opportunity for congregations to really support widows. Now, again, in our society today, we don't have generally folks that have major monetary issues like they did back then. I mean, back then, if there was a widow, she didn't have any chance for providing. I mean, there was no way that she could, of her own self, represent herself and provide in the way that women do today. And so a lot of the ways that we can care for widows today is through, again, just interaction and that communication. Let's go on to a couple other ways in which we can look here at this section, the golden rule in our giving. Let's go to Galatians. Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6. And someone, if you don't mind, read for me there verse 10. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10.
I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is.
Do you happen to be in chapter 6?
I'm sorry, did you say, I thought you said
I may have. It's very possible. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10.
Okay. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith.
Okay, verse 9, and let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. I mean, to be benevolent to others is service. I mean, it takes work. And our responsibility to bestow benevolence and giving to others is charged upon us. As we see here, there is emphasis placed on the Lord's people. There is a need for us to care for our own. If you kind of think about it for a moment, go back to 1 Timothy chapter 5. The family is to care for their own widows. And then if the widow cannot be cared for by the family and she meets the qualifications and the church is able, the church needs to be caring for that widow. 1 Timothy chapter 5. And in a similar way, we have a responsibility for our own, but then we also have a responsibility and opportunity for those who are in need around us. Look with me in 2 Corinthians chapter 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 9. And if someone could read for me here verses 5 through 13. It's kind of lengthy. 2 Corinthians 9, 5 through 13.
So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead to you and arrange in advance the gift you have promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exaction. The point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in all things and at all times, you may abound in every good work. As it is written, He has distributed freely, He has given to the poor, His righteousness endures forever. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way to be generous in every way, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. For the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing in many thanksgivings to God. By their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission that comes from your confession of the gospel of Christ and the generosity of your contribution for them and for all others.
Thank you very much. So you see what's going on here. There's a need. Paul is corresponding with the Corinthians. The Corinthian brethren are aiding in that need. God's people are being cared for, verse 12, but so are others who are in need, verse 12 and verse 13. We have opportunities before us when certain things happen, whether it be a stranger coming in or whether it be maybe a disaster of some kind in this area, where as a congregation we can help and we can take advantage of the difficult set of circumstances that are being presented and show folks the amount of love and care that we have for them in our benevolence and in our willingness to give aid where they need it. Let's go to Matthew chapter 5 as well. Matthew chapter 5. And look with me here, beginning in verse 45. If someone could read for me 45 through 47.
That you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. For if ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same? And if ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so?
Okay, so, if someone, for example, across the street, who has maybe cursed this congregation and, caused troubles, maybe even, I don't know, let's just say they've caused some type of destruction upon this property. If they had an apartment that was burning over there and were in need, should we respond in such a way by saying, they're hollering for help? Well, you know what? They came over here and they weren't very kind to us and they've caused us trouble. We'll just leave it be. No. I mean, absolutely not, right? God is benevolent continuously upon those who are evil. And we also have the opportunity to be good and do good, and be giving, rather, to others. Any other comments on this one? The golden rule regarding giving.
Several times, we got a food pantry back here that we help needy people when they need it. But we've had people come in before needing, matter of fact, this last year, somebody come in, I need some money today, it's $100-something
Right.
to pay my rent. We're gonna be kicked out today.
Right.
So we paid their rent.
Right.
And we set up Bible studies with them.
Right.
And invite them to church, and a couple months later they come back again, and we tell them, hey,
Right.
we've tried to get you to become faithful and study God's word and stuff, and you come to us to help.
Right.
We have got to keep this money for people that really want
Sure.
to learn about God. And,
Right.
I mean, at times that's hard to do. We help the needy, but sometimes you have to cut them off.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and again, I think it's applying the golden rule. If we were in their shoes, would we not want someone to kind of give us some tough love and say, look, can't just keep giving you handouts and, providing, your electric bill when we've noticed this and that and this, and besides you've not in any way been willing to study the Bible with us, you're not going to be provided for eternity, and that's what we care about. We're in the eternity business, not in the temporary business. So if you're not interested in that, then we don't. To your point, I mean, then we're sorry. And that does happen, and that's a challenge for congregations, and it always will be. Let's look at some of these questions. Discussion question 1, and then we might get into the next chapter. What is the golden rule? Why do you think we commonly call Matthew 17:12 the golden rule? I think about what he deals with in the beginning of this chapter. You might remember how he kind of goes through the summary up to this point and says, isn't there just one verse? What is the golden rule?
Do unto others before they do unto you.
Have them do unto you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's what it is, right? But in what way is it impactful in our daily living? I mean, there's a whole host of situations and circumstances, probably within the first hour of us rising up out of the bed, as to how we either failed or succeeded in carrying out the golden rule. There are lots of opportunities for us to apply it, and it can do a great amount of benefit to us.
Do we do to God the way we want him to do to us?
Sure. And does he do
Or
to
the way he has?
right? And does he do to us the way we want him to? I mean, look at what he's done, right? Things maybe we are not even aware of. He's done. Absolutely. All right. Is following the golden rule simple?
No,
I'm going to add a question. Why not? Because I know the answer, right? No. Why? Why is it not simple?
because the other people treat us bad sometimes, and
Sure.
and most people wanna rebel against that and
Right.
do the same thing back to them or worse, and
Right.
that's not how God wants it.
You're surrounded by all these folks who do the opposite of the golden rule, and so even though you are studying the golden rule, it's very tempting to live in a way that you're being treated. Sure. Absolutely. Say it again, it requires work.
Self-sacrifice.
Sacrifice. Sacrifice. Prayer, right? That's the next chapter.
It requires humility. And people don't want to be humble.
Sure.
They want to be elevated.
Humility.
Humility.
Sure. It's a lot easier to say, this is what I've taken care of and this is what I want to do, and I don't really care who's around me and who's in my way. Right? I mean, that's kind of how a lot of folks, to your point, Ms. Sharon, live every day. I mean, me. And the humility comes in saying, me, sit over here for a second, or forever. I'm going to go focus in on others and how I can benefit and aid them. Absolutely.
And your attitude 99% of the time toward everybody is what you have to do to stay with them. Because
Sure.
if your attitude is not good all the time,
Sure. Is it? And that's what being a Christian is, isn't it? I mean, you are constantly under a microscope, right? Think about folks you work with, folks that are in your neighborhood. You and I, we all know just one time of a snark remark, just one time that you fly off the handle or something. There it is. It doesn't matter if you had just exemplified and been carrying out the golden rule for 5 years, and it can be in other words, persistence, right? It's not just one day. I mean, it's every single day carrying this out. Another reason it is not simple. Question 3, may not speak much to this. You can if you'd like, and then we'll get into 4. How can applying this one rule change your life and society as well? Think about that for a second. Remember the domino effect. Do others become influenced when the golden rule is carried out in a group? Yeah. I mean, they may not adopt to it right away, but you can change an entire room of folks because you're carrying out the golden rule. You might have quarrels over here. You might have folks that despise you. You might have all kinds of political issues going on. But carrying out the golden rule, I mean, it can do all kinds of things to impact the functionality and characteristics of a group, and can really begin to kind of snowball just even really small things. Asking folks how they're doing, and then literally waiting for their answer, and then responding, right? Getting folks maybe water, or seeing if you can pick up their tray at the lunch day. Small, just small, again, just being considerate of folks. Evangelistically speaking, 4, how would this rule guide you in teaching the lost? I think we talked a great deal about that. Let's look at 5. What makes applying the golden rule toward those who don't practice it difficult? Well, I think we talked about that too. They don't seem to care.
Well, you're not going to get anything back.
Yeah, right.
So You're
Right.
not gonna get a reward for, a direct reward from somebody for doing good for them.
Not only that, you're probably, in some cases, going to be, despised. I mean, even though you may be attempting to be, everything the way it needs to be in carrying out your interaction with this individual, not only will they not maybe reward you, they might actually shut you out. Right.
Well, others gonna see you and say, who does he think he is? He think he's
Better.
better than we are by
Sure.
doing all that. He's just trying to show out. to
Right.
different people.
Right. Right. And, that's the thing. Nobody's going to come up and give us a blue ribbon for being a Christian,
Except God.
except God in heaven. Right? I mean, if we're expecting others to come around eventually at some point, pat us on the back and say, you know what, I've noticed you have just had a great attitude for the past 15 years, even though I have been just so rude and inconsistent or inconsiderate and unkind to you. And here you go. I want to reward you with a blue ribbon. Folks, it's never going to happen.
If the world's telling you what a good job you're doing, you better figure out what you're doing wrong.
Right? Right.
Sure.
Right. Beware when all men like you. That's a danger. You're probably conforming. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. All right. Next week, Lord willing, we'll get into chapter 9. Prayer-saturated decisions. Again, the domino effect. How does a diligent and thorough prayer life impact our daily living? Think about your prayer life for a second, and think about ways that it can improve. I know we're all in the same boat; it can always improve, but we're going to study that next week, Lord willing. Thank you all very much.